I want to thank the Bedrosian Center for inviting me to come give the paper here. I find that these kinds of workshop presentations where I get to present one paper to exceedingly smart colleagues, both students and faculty, almost always gives me really wonderful feedback. Unlike conferences, unfortunately, where you have 12 minutes and you may get a couple of good ideas, but it's not nearly as helpful as this kind of a presentation. I also want to say that while I did not receive direct funding from Bedrosian specifically for this project, it is actually the kind of outgrowth of a funding that I had for a project on performance management that where I actually gave a paper on that, I think it was a couple years ago. So that resulted in a couple of papers that we're trying to finalize for publication. And in the process of doing that, I became interested first thinking about and noting co-production in the context of performance management. There's sort of a spate of research coming out about residents and other city stakeholders becoming involved, not so much on the receiving end of understanding the quality of public services, but really on the communication end in trying to essentially inform the city. And so there's some of the co-production research that's being done right now is about 311 systems. And actually, Matt is working on a project on 311 that he's going to be presenting at the PMRA conference, the Public Management Research Association conference. And then this is also an outgrowth really of my interest, long-standing interest in civic engagement, which also has co-productive features. So I'm sorry Mike Tom is not here either because he's our third co-author. And I also, finally, this is like an Academy Award speech, so the music will start shortly. I want to thank Matt he's done a masterful job of data assembly and modeling on this. He has done all of the modeling and is continuing working with me as we try and work out what are actually rather complicated modeling questions. So we're looking at co-production, and specifically in the case of police and fire, specifically in California, research in progress. And what we're doing is actually looking at cities in California and looking at the factors that are associated with presence of a volunteer police or volunteer fire program, and then the relative reliance on volunteers in that program among cities that have volunteer policing or volunteer fire. And so we have a two-stage model that we use, and we utilize little known financial data from the state controller's office, which not only provides, I think most people who do work on local government in California know that the controller's office collects data on financial transactions of cities and counties. I'm sure that Frank, as a city official, is quite well aware of that. What is lesser known is that they also provide information about provision arrangements, i.e. the type of contracting or volunteerism, all the different kinds of provision arrangements that cities can use for providing services, as well as we only discovered when we finally got the data electronically, statistics on staffing. So that's our data. And just generally our findings, fiscal factors, scale, politics, and institutions matter. So what is co-production? As I was talking to Jan commented that there's a lot of research on co-production with the Ostrom's workshop when he was at Indiana, and that was in the late 70s and 80s, which was really when there was a large kind of spate of research, and a lot of that research, there's still a little of this focus is on defining what co-production is. And on one end, one scholar kind of commented, well, anything is co-produced because when you consume public services, what's what you do with the service that actually ends up with the whatever good you get. And to me, that's a kind of nonsensical way of defining co-production, because you could say the same thing of markets, that you are going to be co-producing the well-being that you get from eating your lunch right now. That doesn't really help us understand to me, it's not an analytically useful way of framing co-production. It brings to mind an early paper by Aaron Wildowski titled, "If Planning is Everything, Then It Must Be Nothing." So we have to kind of bound this in order to make sense of it. And in simple terms, Jim Ferris wrote a good article on co-production in 1984, and he had just simply said it's the voluntary involvement of citizens in the provision of publicly provided goods and services or close substitutes, which is pretty simple. You can go a little further, though, and think about and I think it's important to widen that a little bit analytically. And so Tony Bovaird, in a PAR article not so long ago, I don't have the date there, it's 2007, actually did an interesting set of case studies on co-production in England and came up with this kind of matrix where you can kind of organize types of co-production, which I do think is actually useful, because I think that the relationship between the user and the public agency, the extent of that relationship is really important, both in terms of the sort of costs of co-production and the likely benefits. And so he distinguished between the planning and the delivery side. So planning can be purely public or co-planned, and delivery can be purely public or co-delivered. And actually he had a third row and column about pure user planning and pure user delivery, and the more I looked at it, the less I liked it, and so I dropped it. I couldn't think of any, actually. He had some examples from England, and I didn't know enough about them to know whether they made sense, and then I couldn't think of very good examples from the US urban context, so I'm gonna have to go back and look at that. But you can think about, on the sort of co-planning with users side, and I'm using policing as an example here because that's one of our two examples. You can have essentially almost pure delivery by public employees. And in policing, you could say, oh, well, but people, they lock their doors or they don't, and they own guns or they don't. I'm kind of ignoring that part of it for this purpose because that's true, but it's almost impossible to actually get data about that or model it. So if you think about traditional service provision, that would be predominantly policing without use of volunteers. There are a couple of kinds of volunteer programs that I'll talk about in a minute. The kind of co-planning would be having user input into the policing process. And so that's part of the idea of community policing. So you could think of the community police advisory boards that we have here in California. Archon Funk did a big study of community engagement in policing and looked at policing advisement in Chicago. And again, it was much more about people coming and meeting with police and advising them and informing them, but not really actually getting involved in the delivery side of things. And then if you think about co-delivery and co-planning, that's kind of a full voluntary engagement on both of the planning, advisement, and delivery side. So you could think of Neighborhood Watch, where you have people not only working to plan what the police will do in their neighborhood, but also working with the police, patrolling and engaging in volunteer activity to kind of address, quote, broken windows like graffiti removal and that sort of thing. Then my work on neighborhood councils, my work with Terry, I should say, on neighborhood councils, our work, I think really falls in that realm primarily, although I think the city would like it to fall in the upper right and not have, certainly, or maybe they just want neighborhood councils to kind of, stay at the community level and just not even bother them. So, yes?
Quick question.
Oh, sure.
Clarifying
Yeah.
question. You are using these terms interchangeably. I just wanted to make sure. In my mind, in my world, there's a difference to legally empowered volunteers versus legally not necessarily empowered volunteers. Neighborhood Watch is not legally empowered volunteer versus a sheriff volunteer is a legally
Right,
empowered.
I will get to that in a
Okay.
minute. Because you're absolutely right, there are two types of volunteers in policing, and I am. I would say that in those two right-hand cells, those are not legally empowered volunteers. So what Matt and I are looking at, and Mike, is this quadrant where users, the public agency is essentially planning the service, and they involve policing volunteers in delivering the service. And I have a slide about this later, but there are essentially two kind of types of volunteers that, as I understand it, and I'm glad to have a city official here, that I understand it from doing my research, not actually serving in a city, that one sees two types of volunteers, reserve officers or sworn officers, who are volunteers who essentially are sworn and actually can carry guns. Those are the kind of legally empowered. And then volunteers who are more like a traditional kind of, they're actually called volunteering and policing services, the program at the federal level that provides grants for this. So they're VIPs. And they tend to do, they're not sworn personnel, they don't carry guns. They tend to do a wide range of kind of more substitutable types of services. So that's where you'd have the people painting out graffiti. Yes, Terry.
So there's also, in LAPD, there's something called specialist reserves. I was a specialist reserve for a while. So I was on the advisory board to the chief about various things. And those people, you know, we carried an ID, but not a badge. We were not sworn, we didn't carry guns.
And how large was this group of people?
Oh gosh, the specialist reserves in LAPD were fairly large because they did a lot of, they worked on budgets, they worked on deployment plans, they worked on advisory committees like the chief's committees. I don't know what the numbers.
They would be more in the advisory area. This is one thing that's a little squishy in the data because I'm not sure, and this is something where I think the numbers aren't that large, but I'm not sure where these folks in the upper right corner, because we weren't actually out there patrolling, right? You were more providing input. So that you would probably be in that kind of co-planning area. I'm not sure that those folks actually show up in the data. We have not, I've gone through and spot checked some of the data against what we're seeing, and it's all this sort of thing. And the numbers look pretty good, fortunately. I was a little afraid, like, what if I go and look and the numbers are terrible? But in fact, you can they have data online and it looks pretty much like what we're seeing. In terms of so I don't think those folks would show up in this lower quadrant. So we're not trying to explain all co-production or even all volunteerism. And I think that's one of the important lessons to take away from here, that it's very context driven and programmatically driven. And so I think public administration should be kind of wary of gross, generalizations about, naive generalizations about co-production. In terms of the distinction that Frank made, we thought we might try and pull those two apart, the sworn and non-sworn, because they have a distinction between people who are doing police, correct me if I'm wrong, police protection as opposed to police officers. The problem with doing that, and so the sworn folks would clearly be police officers. The problem with doing that is that some of these VIPs are like pretend officers, so they do wear, uniforms, and they don't actually, they patrol graffiti. And so it became clear when I was looking through the websites that some cities included them in just kind of the not sworn, not the quote, not police officer, and some of them stuck them into the police officer. So unfortunately, there's sufficient perspective at the local level about who these folks are that we can't do more nuanced analysis. Okay, so I wanted to just say a word about the kind of broader literature on co-production. This is starting to gain popularity in public administration research after having been largely ignored for about 15 years or more. So there's a spate of research on co-production and sort of recognizing the role that users play in the production of public services, primarily coming out of and stimulated by Ostrom's workshop at Indiana. And actually if you're interested in thinking, especially those of you who are doctoral students and think this might be something interesting to work on, I would say start with this Parks et al. Paper, which is actually a workshop paper that came out of a number of workshops at Indiana. And so it has a ton of authors. and that actually is a really good political economy. It's very kind of theorizing about co-production and applying political economic theory. So these papers, and there are a bunch of them actually, the Percy paper and Kaiser there was an Urban Affairs Review, an entire symposium on co-production. And then they tend to be primarily definitional, haggling about definitions, some theoretical exposition, a fair amount of normative kind of like applauding, and then a few sort of naysaying cranks who were just like, oh, this seems great, but no one's going to do it because it's too hard, kind of, and so they did, there are a couple of empirical works. Jim's work is empirical, but primarily descriptive and not necessarily looking at very specific types in a way that allows you to kind of theorize more specifically. Recently, in the last, I would say since the kind of mid-2000s and now even more, there's been, as I said, a recent resurgence of interest, and I think these papers are going to be interesting, and I'm hoping this will sort of be a larger kind of broadening examination. And actually, this was one of the specific themes that the Public Management Research Association identified as a topic that they want to have as a focus for this summer, and so I think that there's hopefully going to, so those of you who are working as doctoral students, there's work to be done here, I think. So it's looking typically much more on specific service areas. This paper by Jacobsen and Jensen, for example, is a Danish paper, really interesting. It's a paper that was published, I think, in PAR. And they looked at actually a natural experiment. Well, it wasn't, no, I'm sorry, it was a random experiment, a field experiment. They were looking at the role that parents play in delivering education services to their kids. And so they were looking in, now I'm forgetting which specific city, a couple cities in Denmark. And they looked at daycare centers, and so these are early language learners, so kids who are preschool kids. And they put together this kind of preschool education kit, and they gave it to they randomly assigned these preschool centers, some of which were in neighborhoods that had large numbers of immigrants, and they randomly assigned schools and then provided parents with these kits. And they did actually find that parents that used the kits, actually they did see better results with the kids. They also, interestingly, found that those results were more important in low-income families. And so it kind of answers this question about equity. And then Clark and Brudney are doing work on 311 services, as I mentioned, primarily looking at again, issues of equity and the distribution of calls with 311. So Tony Bovart's paper that, as I said, is kind of as a case study comparison, points out that there's not a lot of literature, empirical literature on where and why this is happening. And so he asks for more attention to the extent of motivations for co-production, and we're giving it to him, sort of, in one case. So here are some of the arguments that are made about kind of why people would co-produce, the promises of co-production. And these come out, again, a lot of these come out of the earlier literature, the 1980s literature. So one of the most important arguments that folks make, and this comes out of Parks, Jim Ferris's article, and apparently also, as you can see, this is a VIP report, is the argument that you can have improved administrative efficiency by substituting volunteer for paid labor. So you can cope with fiscal stress, or essentially by replacing activities typically that high-paid police staff would do, or higher paid civilians would do, with volunteer labor. So, and actually, according to this report, the independent sector did an assessment of kind of the average value of a volunteer hour and found it was around $21. So, you're going to get administrative efficiency. So you get administrative efficiencies, but the larger social cost, it's kind of a question because these are not looking at the cost to the volunteer. So it could be a means of coping with fiscal stress, which is really the theme of this report, that this may be necessary in times of fiscal stress. Jim argues that there also could be enhanced allocative efficiency, that it's really, as we all know, it's very hard with the case of public goods to assess preferences because of the kind of free rider problem. And so the argument there would be that this can actually be a direct expression of revealed preferences, which is true to an extent. My argument is that free rider problem also affects co-production. And that's one of the arguments that we kind of look at as a complication. And then there's a broader, not so much in the co-production literature, which tends to focus much more on these issues around fiscal coping. I think it was a product of its time in the 1980s, is the observation that you see coming out of my, the work that we've been doing for a very long time, arguing that volunteer association, volunteer work, both provides people civic education and also develops associational social capital. And so that is a value. It's, as I said, it's not explored as much in that literature particularly. And then there's this question about equity effects. As I said, the work by Clark and that Danish paper seemed to suggest that in those cases, co-production doesn't have regressive effects. But you could imagine that if it costs money to run a volunteer program, which is what we're suggesting, that lower income communities may in fact have a harder time doing it. Or may not, very low income communities may not have the kind of managerial capacity to effectively run a volunteer program. And so that's something that we kind of look at. And that's the point. This is the point. Co-production comes at a cost. So it sounds great. Build social capital while you reduce costs. I mean, who doesn't like that idea? But there are managerial challenges, and this has to do partly with the free rider part of the problem and also partly due to the interdependence of production. So if you're actually having co-producers where you have co-producers who are not actually working with the public agent to provide services, then they can kind of do what they want, and if it helps you, that's great, but it's not necessarily going to harm you. So you could think of recycling. If people get in their car and drive stuff to recycling, this is a common example of co-production, get in their car and drive stuff to the recycling center rather than putting all their stuff on the street for bulky item pickup, it clearly reduces costs. It doesn't require any management at all. And so that's relatively easy to do, but particularly in police and fire, these volunteer programs are highly interdependent, particularly when you're talking about sworn officers, for example, or auxiliary firefighters. And so you need to have, you need to be able to, you can see what you have to do to become a volunteer police person in the city of Tempe. So it requires, and then that report I showed you a picture of also emphasizes the costs associated with. Paper by Powers and Thompson argue, well, we should treat co-producers like employers. Well, we're not paying them. And so then the question is, if they don't get extrinsic rewards, how do you actually manage effectively? Because free ridership attenuates those extrinsic rewards. You get a sense, oh, I'm contributing to public safety, but I could just stay at home and let those other volunteers contribute to public safety because the amount I'm doing is having a very small marginal effect. And the point is, the argument is that they have to be intrinsic rewards, and there has to be role alignment or kind of value alignment between the kind of work that's being done and the motivations of the volunteer, is the argument. So, which leads to our model. So taking all this into account, the sense that this is costly but it can have benefits, then we're saying, well, actually, where do we see it in California, and how reliant are California cities in providing in using volunteers to contribute to public safety services? And I have to say, this is a cross-sectional study, so the kind of big empirical limitation of this is that since it's cross-sectional, we cannot attribute causality. Some of these decisions were made based on characteristics of cities that were much longer term. The problem is that we do have time series data, which was our original idea, and then we realized it's sufficiently complicated to model that we decided we would start with this and then move on to the time series. And so that's another advice to doctoral students in the room. Start by modeling simple and then complicate, because otherwise you're going to get yourself into a big morass. Because this has been a lot of work and we're only looking at one cross-section. So I just want to say a word or two about some of these factors. So we have the city scale. We think that there's scale, some sense of scale associated with this stuff. And it's in a quadratic form, which you will remember allows you to model a U-shaped relationship or an inverse U-shaped relationship. And so my prior going into this was that it would probably be an inverse U relationship between population and presence on volunteers, because I thought, well, you need to have a certain amount of administrative capacity to have a program, but then at some point of city size, it may become so complex, services may be so complex, that this just really isn't worth it. That was my reasoning. And actually, that's often what cities, so there's a literature on city scale economies that suggests that you have, increasing returns to scale. So that's kind of the argument there. We have a bunch of fiscal stress variables, because a lot of the literature is talking about, how this reduces cost and can be a response to fiscal stress. And so I won't go into a lot of detail because I don't know how many people out there are interested in California public finance. Probably not, in my heart, I love the subject, but I'm afraid that most people don't. But let it be said that we had to break it out into several different factors. Why? Proposition 13. The piece I want you to look at is, so we have a fiscal capacity index, and I can explain if you're interested how we calculated that. But there's some tax sources that are in effect really not within the control per se of localities, one of which is the property tax, which is effectively, at least not in the short run, effectively set by the state. You can affect it by, obviously through development, but not through changing tax rates. And then actually we had intergovernmental revenues also, which I don't have. That's another kind of out of the control of city fiscal stock. The piece that is important is the idea of sales and hotel taxes. And the idea there is that many of those taxes are paid by people outside of the community. And so that's kind of, you could think of it almost as free money for the locality. So we would think that the more you see cities with a lot of sales and hotel taxes, that gives them greater ability to both provide services, and those services are not being paid for by their residents, and so they're under less fiscal stress as a result. There's a whole literature on fiscal capacity that we could talk about, but as I said, it's kind of eye-crossing for most people. There's some discussion in the literature about how professionalism comes into play, and the argument is that city managers would probably be less likely, this is what some studies suggest, less likely to be sympathetic to co-production because it threatens their professionalism, their professional norms is the argument. On the other hand, one could think that in cities so that's a general law cities, most general law cities general law cities in California are council manager cities, so one would expect that's kind of a proxy for professionalism, as opposed to a charter cities, those tend to be more politicized cities. And we say this is an ambiguous effect because we would expect unions to be more powerful in charter cities, and we also don't think unions are necessarily going to be sympathetic to having volunteers replace their labor. We look at, just in the policing models, we look at property and violent crime data. This was kind of a big bear to get, so thanks again, Matt. And we would assume that property crime would have a positive effect because it's almost like a demand factor, that people would be more interested in having more services or possibly more motivated to get involved if there's kind of petty crime or property crime, whereas we would expect violent crime to have a negative effect simply because, again, we would expect it to be more risky to use volunteers in a city that has a high violent crime rate, as well as people being maybe less inclined to want to get out on the street and help. One of the factors that we include that isn't in a lot of the, well, actually, I haven't seen any studies that do exactly this, so I can't say, but I think it's ignored in a lot of the literature, is the role of political ideology. And the reason that we're including political ideology in this is, first of all, from a demand side, one might expect higher demand, residential demand for public safety in more conservative cities, maybe more so for police than fire. But the second point is that there may be a higher kind of ideological alignment with volunteering in the area of public safety in more conservative cities. And the factor that we use for that is not voter registration, which is an extremely poor measure of political ideology in California because we have lots of independents who are swing voters. And, but rather the proportion of votes cast for Meg Whitman, the Republican candidate in 2010. And finally, the other institutional variable that we include is a variable about whether or not the city contracts out for services, because for one thing, contracting can be a substitute way of reducing cost of service, and secondly, it would be more expensive to manage volunteers if you're having to kind of coordinate them somehow with a contractee, so the contractor. So typically cities who contract out in California contract with the county. Yes, sure.
About the professionalism measure, I think the county, the charter versus general law city distinction might not be a good proxy because usually it's more about sort of the stronger desire for local self-governance in your charter cities. Maybe professionalism, more like whether you have a council manager form of government. That since a lot of charter cities also still have a council manager form. So maybe a good proxy would be whether you have a directly elected mayor, then those would be more politicized.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the reason we're using this is because all general law cities in California are council manager, and charter cities are many
charter cities
yeah.
are also council managers.
Yeah, that's a good, I think we can pull that. That's probably a good idea to get that better, less fuzzy measure of that, so that's a very good suggestion, and I think we can find that.
But it just happens to be in California, you're probably okay.
Yeah, only
Because
for
they kind of fall in both of your explanations in California. I don't know about outside, but what Jan just said and what you just said in California happens to kind of go hand in hand.
Right, so that's a good suggestion. I don't have my pen, okay. I'm going to make a mental note of that. We also have a number of control variables, income and demographic variables and unemployment. So okay, so now let's, so our data sources, real quick. We use data on service provision from the state controller's financial transactions of cities. Our demographic data came from the census. And, sorry, I have to get caught up with myself. We got the voting, by we I mean Matt, got the voting data from the statewide data project at UC Berkeley, and then crime statistics from the Uniform Crime Reports, which is a little problematic, and it's something that we have to keep working on because there's some missing data for cities in the Uniform Crime Reports, and we have to manage to fix that before we can publish this. So, okay, and then our empirical approach is that we use a two-stage qualitative choice model. So the issue is that we are trying to, one of the things we're looking at is relative reliance on volunteers, which is more informative than just whether or not people have a volunteer program, because they could have a completely tokenistic volunteer program that doesn't do anything and it's just a few people. And so the problem with just looking at the presence of volunteers is that if you just look at the presence of volunteers in cities that have programs, you have a censored sample. And so that can lead to bias in your estimators. And so there's a Heckman's probe. It is a way of dealing with this in the first stage. we model the presence of a volunteer program using Probit. And then you can estimate the Mills ratio, which is an estimator of the mean error term in that stage, and then you include it in the second stage, and it corrects for that error, that potential bias. Okay, so moving to results. So I'm going to just work, I'm sorry. This just is some data on how frequently we see service provision. So what we're looking at is this right here. Direct provision with volunteers, contracting with volunteers, and volunteers alone. You see, obviously, we don't have any kind of paid volunteer police who are not actually coordinating with the police department, but there are 14 volunteer fire departments still in California. And then you see that there's actually very little, very few cities provide services with volunteers and also contract out. And then there's these other sort of different kinds of arrangements. We have data like this actually on 11 services in California. So at some point we're going to try and do some work with that, but that's really even more complicated than this.
So that goes back to Frank's question. So in the measurement, volunteers, any kind of volunteers, not well defined, right?
They really fall in, well, this is essentially, these are the kinds of volunteers you see. They typically are either like a police department reserve who are sworn officers in policing. You can't see this. My other picture of the VIP program it disappeared in one stage of PDF, my PowerPoint. But this is like a little volunteer program where and you can't really read it, but you can help people with bilingual translation, computer software, administrative, writing skills, special events. I mean, so there's this kind of two set types of volunteers, and they are programs. That's why folks can count them. So and you have to have a background check for either of them. So these are actually formal programs, and they typically fall into one of these two camps, either this kind of VIP type program where they're not sworn officers and they're doing a wide array of kind of community activities and then also helping out in the police station, or those guys with guns. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Raphael.
I'll let you finish that.
No, go ahead.
So you have 467 cities.
Mm-hmm.
That's all of them that were alive as of when?
2010.
Do you have anything about age of city in your model?
We have had it in our model, and we didn't include it this time because we put in the contracting variable. So we've used it in other. Because the contracting variable is really collinear with age because of the Lakewood plan.
So that's 1954. So there's a lot of cities that contract for their police department.
They're all new cities, so it's really highly
And
correlated.
there are no
with
new
age.
cities that do it on their own?
There are some, but it's so highly correlated. Yeah, I mean, we have had it, and we are still wrangling the model, but I will say that we've done it without, and it hasn't made a huge difference as far as we can tell. But yeah, I mean, age will make a difference. Age will make a difference, I'm thinking, particularly with volunteer fire, which is why Matt and I have been talking about this. So, no, that's fine. So, okay, so these are the volunteers in policing. You can see what they're doing. They're very different than the reserve officers, and I would really like to be able to pull them apart, but at least initially going through this, it didn't seem that we could, but we may look and see. And then one sees the same kind of pattern in firefighting. So here are auxiliary firefighters who actually may get involved in more direct fire activities, probably not very risky ones. Sierra Madre has a purely volunteer fire department, but then you can see Long Beach has these kind of volunteers that if you read the description of what they do, it's very similar to what the VIPs do. So they might go and help clear brush. It's more focused on prevention, and they don't get involved in direct service delivery that is highly risky. So yeah, I mean, and that's, I think, an issue with the kind of, we haven't been able to tease those two apart in our analysis. Okay, so here are our findings to start with. So you can see contracting, this is true in all of our models. We only include contracting in the first stage. It's an identifier variable, and we didn't see, any reason why that would really have an effect on the size of the force in the second stage. So, contracting is a very powerful variable. The only fiscal variable that consistently shows up as significant is this, what I think of as this kind of revenue exportability variable, so that you see that cities that have higher per capita sales and hotel taxes are less likely to have a volunteer program. It's really a strong effect too, which makes me uncomfortable. So I've been trying to play around with it because my concern is it may be something that's not really about the amount of revenue they have, but something about the type of city that they are. That's my concern, and they may have more, mobile, residents or something like that. I've looked at all of these cities. Santa Monica is one of them, for example.
Yeah, and when you look at the sales in a hotel, you have to look at the capacity of visitors they're bringing in, because they basically give it away on the smaller deals. It's all given away. It's really the bigger events that they're really collecting that from. And you have to look and see if that plays into that. So you've got a city that can attract the larger events and therefore attract the additional.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of factors that we need to think of. So that's something that we're continuing to think about. And if folks have ideas about that, I'm going to pick Frank's brain. And then we see, as we predicted, that political ideology, we see much more cities. We see the voting, conservatism of voting is highly associated with presence of these programs, and as are property crime rates. What we don't see being significant is scale, and most of the fiscal variables are not significant, which as I said, I'm kind of not convinced by the hotel tax thing, and I have to keep working on that. My thinking is that on this is that a lot of these cities who are fiscally stressed may be contracting out, and so that's sort of capturing all the fiscal stress adjustment, but I don't know, this is messy. So this is our prediction of essentially relative reliance on volunteers. And here you can see that scale does make a difference. So just the way these quadratic terms work is that if you have a negative regular term of population, so that means it just decreases to a point, and then your positive squared term kicks in and it starts to increase. So this model's a U-shaped curve. And you can, so this is completely counter to my prediction, which was that this would kind of consistent with a lot of the public finance literature on economies of scale would be an inverse U. It's a U-shaped curve. And you can figure out where the inflection point is, in other words, the point at which it increases again by taking the derivative. This is reaching back to calculus, taking the derivative and then setting that equation to zero, and the inflection point at which the kind of relative reliance increases rather than decreases as an effective scale is at 600,000 essentially, just very large. So I think it's fair to say that for the most part, I mean, we do have cities in our sample that have volunteers that are big, but I think it's fair to say that for the most part, what we see is essentially it's a declining function of revenue. And then it's that relative reliance on volunteers is a positively associated with, again, conservatism and the percentage of the population over the age of 65, which is perhaps not surprising because a lot of these VIP programs specifically reach out to older individuals. Some of them are, that's a specific target. And then we do see violent crime rate negatively associated with it. But again, we don't see any action with the fiscal capacity variables. Yeah.
Sure. I was wondering, say, a lot of cities, say, the county of Los Angeles, they contract with the county sheriff.
Correct.
So I wonder whether the county sheriff have any parameters in terms of endorsing, supporting volunteer involvement. Maybe if the county doesn't prefer that, then maybe the majority of the cities in that particular county will have or have
Yeah, we
no
see
say.
very few cities that contract out that have volunteer departments. And I think it's partly for that reason. It could be that it's too much work for the city, or the county doesn't want to do it. It's not zero. There are a small number of cities that contract out either for fire or for police that have these programs. But I think they are highly substitutable. Frank?
You're talking about separately having volunteers, because they
Yes.
do have,
We're
the
not
sheriff
look-
department does have their own volunteer program, and they do use quite a bit of volunteers to do a lot of different functions. But we don't
One second,
have
I'm not-
separately volunteers in the city as a contract city that does policing functions.
Correct, and just to be clear, we're not trying to predict the presence of co-production in at the community level in California, because there are lots of kinds of police co-production that we're not capturing, and we're not capturing the county. What we are capturing is essentially we're modeling this as a municipal choice model. So you're correct. And I think this is something we also want to look at, and we're still trying to think about whether we want to try and model charter the choice to contract as a multinomial model.
I think it's on a regional model. I don't think it's within the cities themselves or even the suburbs. I think they go like metropolitans entities. There's entities that want to just privatize that type of policing, whether it's like the metro buses, or if it's the airport, like with TSA too, I guess. And I think that's what helps the city too with their managing, because they don't have to devote all their initiatives on those programs, where they have other entities like the private security companies and the businesses that want to join in those types of policing in the cities too.
Yeah, it's a complex phenomenon at the regional level for sure. Was there another?
So Frank's question is interesting. How do the county level volunteers show up in your data?
Well, the way the data is because data
I'm assuming it's
plural.
not there.
Yes. Well, the county volunteers would not show up there. That's my point. We're only modeling direct volunteers who are managed by and work with city employees. And so that's why I'm saying we're modeling this as a municipal choice model, thinking about what causes cities to decide to do this.
But this is important, because many of the cities who aren't going to have it are going to say, well, we don't need it because we already are covered by that. And so it may not be thinking about any of these things. It may be like, we already got one, and we don't have to put it on our books. So,
Well, that's part of in the identification stage, when we have the dummy variable for whether or not they contract out for both policing and fire. So that,
but do you know if every contracted out police and fire department has a volunteer club?
No. That's
Right,
something
because
that-
there could be variation in that. And
Yeah.
so you could see variation at this stage if
True.
there's variation at that stage.
True. I mean, we have 58 counties, so we could probably look at that. Yeah, I mean, it's possible. We don't have the data.
With the numbers, you've eliminated here 50% of the cities in the county of Los Angeles alone, because about 44 cities in the county of Los Angeles contract with the LA County Sheriff's Department. We are about 28% of the total sheriff's budget as contract cities. So those, I'm assuming, are not in here. And if they're not in here, they probably, because of how this works, they are not having any volunteers on their own on the policing and the fire side.
6 of them
Because they're
are.
relying on the sheriff and the,
6 of them are.
okay.
I could make that argument. I mean, I think Rafael's argument is a really good one, because we don't have that county context variable, and it's something that I think we need to look for, and we probably could find, because it's only 58 counties, so it wouldn't be the onerous. The one tricky thing about doing that, and I'm not sure how we would solve this, is that you don't know where those volunteer sheriff departments, the volunteer sheriffs are deployed. That would be the one tricky thing, because they could possibly be focusing only in one city, or they could possibly only be working downtown. So I think that's the other. And so then the other thing that I think is, I think it's a really good point, and we should look at it. The other thing is, these decisions typically come out of police chiefs. And so it's not, I think that I don't think that the international fire chiefs of America, they're partnering on that VIP program. So this is a chief type of decision, and they are kind of, act a little bit, they have, I'm not sure how to put it. Someone might, they tend to exert a lot of power. So my sense is, to the extent that there's kind of like a demand thing, we want to do this, it's probably less likely to be city managers or city councils saying, oh, we have fiscal problems, fiscal stress, we need to use police, we need to use, have a volunteer fire department, and more a police chief saying, this is a way that I can connect to the community, or my budget is getting cut because our county is in fiscal stress, and this is a way I can handle it. And that's not going to be helped by looking at the sheriff. So that may be, so I think it's definitely something that we want to look at, maybe talk to some police chiefs to figure that out.
I don't want to complicate your life, Juliet. but-
No, this is
but-
why I'm talking to all of you, because we
But-
need to have, we've complicated it for like
Yeah.
months now, and now we need other people to help us complicate it
So-
further.
58 counties are not the only ones. I bet you there are cities also that contract with other cities.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you need to be, I'm sorry, but that's just the sheer reality on the ground, that you will have.
Yeah, another 20.
But, yeah, I don't remember the numbers on that off the top of my head,
But
but
there
we
are-
do have the data
Okay.
on the type of contracting that they do. So we know
Okay.
whether it's with the county, whether it's with another city, whether there's a broad range.
There's actually a variable for contracting with a private entity, which none of these folks do.
Right. So we have all that. I can tell you, though, off the cuff, that the proportion of cities that contract for police and fire that don't contract with the county is pretty small.
I agree.
It's
I absolutely agree.
large.
I can tell you that as well.
I
Yes.
have a strange question. Do the volunteers handle paperwork, the reports and things like that? Have you looked at the trust accounts?
Well, some of them handle paperwork, but my sense from looking at a lot of this is based on documentary research, going through web pages to see what they are describing as job duties that folks would do. They're not doing sensitive work in most of the volunteers who are doing sensitive work are the sworn officers. The volunteer VIPs, to the extent that they're doing work in the office, it might be working as a translator. That would be a really good example. They might do filing, but I don't think that, who would want to file? I don't think they're going to keep those volunteers.
I'm bringing this up because part of the problem with police departments is that, or at least the one I see in Los Angeles, they have the worst filing system in the world, just throw it in the box. And they sweep all the trust funds because they never give anyone reports. And that kind of sweeping of trust funds is a problem because there is inefficiencies, and yes, it goes into the budgets, and maybe they're doing it for that. There's really no efficiencies there. So, I don't know who
Yeah, I don't
who's
think-
in charge, but it is
That's not going to involve volunteers. That's a separate problem that this would not solve or exacerbate. Okay, so getting back to this, again, we see the same U-shaped curve. And in this case, the inflection point is at 2 million. So, it's really going to be primarily a downward sloping curve. And again, the percentage of population over the age of 65 and conservatism are associated with, and the violent, I think I may be repeating myself. I'm sorry if I am. I'm on my 4th day of talking to people in public. So, okay. And then the violent crime rate, as we predicted, is negatively associated. Yes?
And that equation at the bottom is the model for the column.
This down here,
Yeah.
it tells you whether the model, right here, row, that tells you whether or not the Mills ratio, which is essentially the correction for error, is significant. And you can see it's not statistically significant. So it doesn't, you can never accept the null hypothesis. You can only fail to reject the null hypothesis. But anyway, it doesn't have statistical support for this issue around censorship that we thought. And then this tells you, the Wald chi-square tells you whether the whole system of equations is significant, and it is. So that's what that is. Okay, and then, moving on to fire services. Here we see, again, the same contracting point, and that charter cities are much less likely to contract out. And I think I think the age including, this is where I think we really need to include the age variable, which Matt and I were talking about this, and then things just got hectic towards the end. And so I think that is important, because a lot of the volunteer fire departments or fire departments that have a lot of auxiliary firefighters had either their kind of gold rush era cities, small cities that started out with volunteer fire departments and never converted because they didn't grow. Like the city of Stockton started out with the volunteer fire department and then converted to a paid. That's very common in older cities. But I think that those cities that started out with volunteer fire departments and a variable we cannot get, were more likely to continue to have a volunteer. And we could get at that maybe with the age. See, this is why I need you at these kinds of talks, Raphael. So.
On the charter issue also, Juliet, there are about 140 some charter cities in the state of California, and if you look at them individually, there's probably, my guess is that the reason why they have their own, there's a tipping point, whether it makes sense for them to contract or not to contract. Most of those decisions are probably more economic in nature,
Right.
where it doesn't make sense for them to contract because contracting would be as much expensive or even more because of, these are typically larger cities, the most charter cities.
Right.
So
older cities.
probably there's an economic factor there.
Right, that's
or
why
a tipping point.
I'm thinking that may be part of the reason that we're not seeing any action in our fiscal variables. And I also will tell you that I published a paper some years ago with Pascal Marcelli, who's now at San Diego State, and we found, we were actually looking at changes in service provision over a 10-year period, and which is what we want to do, because that's a better way of trying to be explanatory, is to look at how particular factors cause change. And we found that fiscal factors were very influential. So, I'm sorry, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just noticed how many fire stations are popping up, and there's a lot of depots, brand new ones being built from the ground up. I think if that's what the cause is, to have these facilities, to have these new buildings, then the volunteer organizations have divisions within those frameworks.
Yeah, I'm not sure how capital facilities, how the presence of new fire stations would fit into this. We see here's the one other fiscal variable that mattered. Per capita intergovernmental revenue was negatively associated. Again, it's a kind of an exported tax, if you could think about it that way. So we need to spend some more time with the fiscal variables. And again, we see the same U-shaped curve. And in this case, now I'm blanking on the inflection point was, I think, at 400,000. It was smaller. It was at a smaller level, I think. So I thought I wrote it down.
So how do you measure fiscal capacity again?
The way that we measure fiscal capacity, and there's a big literature on this, Helen Ladd wrote a paper on this with John Yanger, or a book on it actually a long time ago, and Howard Chernick has done a lot of work on this. He's on looking at fiscal capacity in New York, and just using a measure of like your average revenue or your per capita revenue, or whether or not you are running a budget surplus, is not a really good measure, because it conflates your current fiscal status with preferences. And so you could have cities that actually could, in fact, raise a lot of taxes but choose not to as a matter of political choice. So those fiscal measures are conflating choice of residents for taxes and ability to tax. And so there are a couple of different ways to actually come up with an index that can be a proxy. And we used one of them that's in fact easier to model, which is that you look at the average tax rate. In other words, the kind of share. We pulled out those uncontrollable things: property tax, quote, exportable taxes. We just treated them as purely exportable, just for ease, and then intergovernmental revenue. And then we looked at the share of revenue of total residential income that was essentially, we looked at total fiscal resources as a share of residential revenue in the county. So we could see in the county, X% of revenue is used for public services. Then you make kind of like, you evoke TBO, and you assume that these cities are in a competitive position, and that if anyone diverges too far from that percentage share, that you're going to start having flight of residents, wealthier residents, flight of businesses. And so then you kind of, the proxy is that you take the county-wide share percentage of revenues, and then you apply it to each city's income. And it tells you how much the city would earn in revenue of these sorts that it can control if it actually taxed at the county effective tax rate. That's essentially one of the two measures that's used a lot in the fiscal capacity literature. But then we have to look at these other taxes over which this county or the city doesn't have control. So that's the fiscal capacity index.
Juliet,
yeah.
sorry, we have to wrap it up.
Okay, well, this is it actually, and then I'm going to, this is my final, similar results, we don't have to go. I'll just go into my summary. So it's clear that contracting and co-production seem to be substitutes, and I think we need to look at this point that Raphael is bringing up. And as I said, we've been talking about trying to use multinomial logit or nested logit to try and look at these as simultaneous choices. That's a whole other conversation that we can't, I want to talk, that's what I called you about. That's what I called you about. We can't do, I don't think you can do Heckmans with the multinomial logit though, that's my dilemma. We didn't see, none of our control variables really showed anything, which suggests that we're not seeing patterns of co-production with respect to race or income that might be worrisome. Voluntarism, there's this kind of strange, what I thought was counter to my presumption, so I need to go and think about that and look at the finance literature a little more. Yes?
How do you have race how does race come?
I know I didn't show you the variable because I didn't want to put a huge model, and we use percentage of the population that's non-Hispanic, African American, and percentage of the population that's Latino.
Because you might want to do something around sort of population diversity.
We could use an index of disparity.
As opposed to just minority share, because you might think that the more micro communities you have in a city, the more you want to have specialized volunteers or something to target that or something like that.
Right, that's a good suggestion. Did you write down index of disparity? Thanks. That's a good suggestion. And then essentially we found that, how I would summarize it, is that be cautious about generalizing about the wonders of co-production because it's costly. We think it's costly not in a way necessarily related to fiscal stress, but the likelihood of seeing it suggests that it's going to be context dependent. And especially the political ideology piece is something that we're continuing to think about. And then also I would argue that we need more studies in public administration of co-production in different service contexts, because I think that the kind of generalization across services that we saw in the earlier literature is not getting us to a good understanding. These are our next steps. We're rankling our modeling. We want to do a cross-sectional study, as I mentioned. This is why I want to buttonhole Raphael to get some help on the modeling, because it's starting to get to beyond my understanding of some of these complex maximum likelihood estimation models. And then we have an idea for a second paper, which is possibly to look at the shock of the housing crisis on state-local fiscal relationships and service provision. I was actually at the Urban Affairs Association conference, and there was a whole panel on this, and none of them, the papers were not looking at it longitudinally, they were looking at it cross-sectionally, which is even worse. And so I think that there may be a way to do this, but the modeling may be beyond me, so I may need to enlist a really good methodologist. So, okay, so that's it, and thanks for all your great questions all the way through. Do you have a question, Dan?
Maybe a couple of questions.
I began with an analytical framework that includes social capital, and as you were doing that, particularly on the policing side, not so much on the fire, I'm thinking, do you know anything about the response to either in terms of trusted governance in those areas where there was more co-production or agency legitimacy where there was more co-production, which I think relates to your social capital. I'm not positive, but we've lost it in the results.
Right, and we don't have, yeah, unfortunately, we're not looking at the effects, and that's not a variable that we could find. So,
Which is the cause effect here? You can't find the variables, you're not looking, or you're not interested?
no, I'm interested in ultimately I'm interested in the effect that having these kinds of voluntary programs has on effectiveness of service delivery and governance, because that's what drives all of my research. But this paper isn't answering that question yet, and so that's the hopefully over the time we'll get it. But it's a very hard thing to do because we don't have measures, so it's kind of both.
Yeah, that's actually, may I ask the last question? So
Sure.
ultimately, so why does it matter? Does any form of voluntary arrangement would actually do a better job in terms of having a safer community? Are there opportunities for doing that kind of impact analysis?
Well, that's where we may get eventually. I think this just suggests that one needs to look at the context when thinking about trying to launch a volunteer program, and that it's not costless, and context matters. So it's more of a cautionary kind of paper than a this is what we should do paper. But if folks have ideas about how we could look at the effects of this on outcomes that are interesting, particularly social capital, and deal with issues of endogeneity, then I would be really, really happy to talk to you. Possible dissertation right there. So, okay, well, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for their excellent